Welcome back, everyone. I hope you've been enjoying these sessions. This next one is one that, well, in addition to all the other sessions I'm looking forward to. My dad was a Marine in the 1st Marine Division in the 1950s, and all the heroes from the Second World War that I think probably chewed him out as drill sergeants, are larger than life. And so, I think that's really shaped my consciousness as well. Now, this next conversation, blends two topics that I'm sure everybody's going to be excited to hear more about. The Devil Dogs of K Company, part of the storied 1st Marine Division, landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942. And of course, Marine Eugene B. Sledge, who penned the classic memoir and his experience in the 1st Mardiv in the battles of Peleliu and Okinawa with the old breed. To discuss these topics, we have Saul David, award-winning author of Devil Dogs, King Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, from Guadalcanal to the shores of Japan. And also with us is Henry Sledge, Eugene Sledge's son, who himself is an author and consultant. So, Saul and Henry, welcome aboard. They'll offer some great views on the legacy of Eugene Sledge and on the Devil Dogs. But joining us, I think this is like triple duty today, is Rich Frank once again to spearhead this effort. So with that, Rich, Charlie, Mike, thanks.
Got it. Question has come up is, how is it that I, and I alone, do 3 panels? I attribute this to my background originally as a ship guy, and I was always intrigued with the Royal Navy. And my favorite Royal Navy command was, all hands lay aft to witness punishment. And that has served me very well in many capacities, including here at the museum. One of the most solemn obligations of this museum is in our charter, which is to tell the American story of World War II. And how the museum has interpreted that, based on the work of Steve Ambrose and Nick Mueller, is that we tell not only a story from the top down, but from the bottom up and everything in between, as you've seen in our wonderful panels we've had today and yesterday. In this session, we're going to look at the war of one company of the 1st Marine Division. This is Company K, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. The Marines referred to this as K-35. A vital part of our entry portal into this, of course, is what Mike referred to, that classic, some would say the classic, American memoir of World War II by Eugene Sledge, the immortal with the old breed at Guadalcanal. And as Mike said, our guides on this, Saul David and Henry Sledge. And once again, you've already learned I'm not much into long introductions, but just let me reiterate that Saul is a award-winning, not only author, but he does a lot of production of things. And I can testify from my contact, he's an all-around wonderful guy. I can say that those of you who are familiar with Saul's work will be delighted that he's here. And those of you who are not familiar with his work will learn why you should be. Now, Henry Sledge is Eugene Sledge's son, which brings an extraordinarily special perspective on what we're doing here today. I would note also his son is in the audience, so we will talk about one generation and we'll have present 2 generations of the Sledge family today. Henry has brought along an artifact, which is down here in front of the dais, which is the actual pack Eugene Sledge carried in his campaigns in World War II. His name is printed on that thing. In my view, that's sort of like having a holy relic here. I think the one thing I want to do here is, rather than go into any elaborate comment, but I think I have a little very short slideshow. This is thanks to an exchange between myself and my great friend of the museum, John Parshall, that many of you know. And we were talking about how do you illustrate the dead. And John came up, okay, there we go. John came up with this idea. The base map is Europe. The red outline is the maximum extent of the Battle of the Bulge, which was the greatest campaign, and certainly in terms of American casualties on the European theater. And superimposed over that, you will see the island of Okinawa and at the southern end of that, the area where the overwhelming principal fighting took place, and that's where Eugene Sledge fought. Within that, you will also notice there's a small little notch, which is Iwo Jima, in sort of a pinkish color there. That's about 8 square miles. Peleliu was about 5 square miles. That gives you some reference points in terms of the intensity, or one way to look at the intensity of combat in the Asia-Pacific theater. And finally, John put together some numbers and I elaborated on them. And this, in terms of elaborating on what this really means in terms of real life, you got Tarawa, where you find out the US deaths per square mile measured out to 1,710. Peleliu, about 307. Iwo Jima, 875. And Okinawa, about 121. And then you'll see at the far end of the corner how that measured up to the bulge. Tarawa was 180 times, Peleliu 32 times, Iwo Jima 92 times, and Okinawa 13 times. And that's just one way we try to illustrate exactly what happened in those Marine campaigns during World War II. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Saul.
Thanks so much, Rich. I'm going to start with a quote, and the quote is...
We have it up?
When we get it up.
There we go.
Just trying to move that forward, sorry. Okay, and the quote is by this man, Sergeant Thurman T.I. Miller. You can see him, of course, on the left as you look at that picture. The quote begins like this. That day on the Matanika, we beheld all the horrors of war, all the degrees of degradation to which the human race could descend. We were hardened by much training, and our reflexes were sudden. Our minds alert, but now our killing potential was amplified. A second ingredient, hatred, had been added. What kind of warfare was this? So what's the context for that quote? Well, it comes from the 12th of August, 1942. 5 days into the Guadalcanal campaign. And Miller and his fellows from Company K had just happened upon one of the most gruesome events of the Guadalcanal campaign, and that's the fate of the Gurkha Patrol. I'm not going to go into the details of the Gurkha Patrol. All you need to know is that when Company K found the remains of this patrol, the Japanese hadn't just killed the patrol, they'd butchered it. And they'd carved it up and left the body parts on the beach, effectively as a warning to the Marines. I'm going to give you a second quote now, and that's from this man, Jim McHenry. I should have just said, actually, going back to Miller for a second, he was a West Virginian, quite significant part of the story of American servicemen, I suppose, in the Second World War and many wars, is that a lot of them came from the Appalachians. They tend to make good fighters there. But he came from a very dirt-poor background in Otsego in West Virginia. He was one of 16 siblings, but he turned into, as you will discover, a very effective devil dog. Jim McHenry, very different background. He came from New York. And Jim McHenry was also on the patrol that found these remains. And he wrote, "The first thing I saw was the severed head of a Marine. The first thing I saw was the severed head of a Marine. The head was moving back and forth in the water and looked like it was alive. Then I realized it was just bobbing in the small waves, lapping at the shore." For most of these guys in Company K, this was their first experience of war. And the last quote I'll give you is by a young 17-year-old. And he asked the question, which is pretty reasonable to ask in the circumstances, why would anyone do this? Wasn't killing them enough? As Rich has already said, they're all members of K-35. They came from disparate backgrounds across the United States. It's interesting, in the UK, the Marines often have a sea experience. They tend to come from the coastal regions. That's not necessarily the case in the United States. These guys are from right across the continent. They come from very different backgrounds, as I've already explained. And in the case of Eugene Sledge, he was really effectively from a college background, middle class. And what makes his memoir so significant, I think, is that it was from the perspective of an enlisted man. He had this extraordinary sensitivity, and we'll be hearing more about that, I'm sure, from Henry later on. But just to tell you a little bit about the name Devil Dogs, and this will give you a clue. Teufelhunden, US Marines. This was actually a recruitment poster, a First World War recruitment poster, and that's where the name came from. Its derivation is much discussed, actually, because so the story goes, the Germans were so impressed by the performance of the 5th Marines at Below Wood that they gave them this sort of honorific, you know, impressive guys, devil dogs, Teufel Hunden. There is no documentary support for this claim. It was probably invented by an American journalist. But what really matters is not its derivation, it's the fact that it's stuck. It could have been awarded. The 5th Marines themselves really liked the name, and therefore the name stuck, and it is still used to this day for the 5th Marines, and probably more generally for Marines, actually, but anyway, the 5th Marines in particular. As I say, they came from all different backgrounds. I don't have time to go into the full detail of all the campaigns, so just give you some broad brushstrokes. Guadalcanal first. Well, Guadalcanal is the first ground offensive of the Second World War of all American troops. It's fought in effect to save Australia, but also in an attempt to roll back the recent advances by the Japanese in the Pacific. And it is a knife-edge campaign that I think Rich agrees is really the turning point in the Pacific. Not so much Midway. The Japanese are still moving forward after Midway, but Guadalcanal is a real turning point. And the battle is chiefly fought by the 1st Marine Division with, of course, K Company forming a crucial part of it. They land unopposed. I think I've got a nice, well, a little bit of orientation for the Pacific. I can't really show you in detail where we're talking about, but if you look at the bottom middle of the map, you can see Guadalcanal. That's off to the east of Australia. And a little bit above that is New Britain, and then you move on to Peleliu, and then if you go all the way up close to the Japanese home islands, you can see Okinawa. So those are the 4 campaigns. Guadalcanal, as I think I've already mentioned, begins on the 7th of August, 1942. And it's a real shock to the system for these guys. It's a hurriedly planned campaign. They probably don't have as much equipment and certainly ammunition as they need to begin with. And they have a double trouble very quickly, because on the night of the 8th and 9th of August, a scene that's dramatically shown, I think, in the mini-series Pacific, is that night naval battle at which 4 cruisers of the US Navy, well, in fact, one is Australian, but nevertheless, 4 cruisers are sunk by a Japanese night attack. And the consequence of this attack, not that the warships were withdrawn, they were going to be withdrawn anyway, the carrier support, but that the supply ships get pulled out quickly too. And so the Devil Dogs get left with this incredibly tricky situation of having to fight a pretty ruthless enemy, as I've already explained. They're in jungle, tropical conditions that is going to cause a lot of problems to the physique and the general welfare of the men. A lot of them get malaria, a lot of them get dysentery, jungle sores, but they also don't have enough to eat, and they are constantly in combat. What's extraordinary about Guadalcanal is that there is no respite, and although they land with the intention of capturing this is the landing. The landing, by the way, was the best bit of the campaign because it was unopposed, but it turns pretty nasty thereafter. And what you get, quite interestingly, is a campaign that is begun with an attempt, as they often were in these islands, to capture the airfield. The Japanese were constructing an airfield. That takes place pretty quickly the following day. But the problem is, how can you hold the airfield? And so what begins as an assault on the island actually ends up as a defensive action, at least for the first month and arguably for the first couple of months. And it's a real knife-edge situation. Are they going to hold out long enough before the Japanese can bring in reinforcements? The Japanese have really got chiefly control of the air and also of the sea for a big chunk of this campaign. Just to move once. So that's the defensive perimeter. Most of the fighting, I don't have time to talk about the individual actions, but most of the fighting takes place trying to defend the airfield in the center of that defensive perimeter on Guadalcanal. Now, when we get to the end of Guadalcanal, at least for the Devil Dogs, we're now moving on to December 1942. The conditions of the soldiers when they come off the island will tell you everything about the experience they had.
Marines.
Sorry, did I say soldiers?
Yes.
Marines.
I
Troops,
warned you about that.
troops or Marines, but not
We
soldiers.
coached you on that.
It clearly is in one ear and out the other. But their conditions was really severe. What do we mean by this? Well, Miller had lost a third of his body weight, and you can bet your bottom dollar, given the background he came from, he wouldn't have had much body fat to begin with. So they were walking scarecrows when they come off the island. But what is the effect of this campaign? As I say, it was a big turning point in the Pacific. And I'll just read you out a couple of quotes, one by a Japanese general and one by Marshall, who, of course, was US Army Chief of Staff. I think I can call him a soldier.
You're safe there.
Yeah, sorry, I moved on too far. The Japanese general Kawaguchi described it as the graveyard of the Japanese army, and for Marshall, it was the turning point in the Pacific. Thanks to the resolute defense of these Marines and the desperate gallantry of our naval task forces, they had made the difference. What were the casualties? 30,000 Japanese soldiers, airmen, and naval personnel were killed in the campaign. And for the Americans, both Marines initially and also soldiers, we're talking about 7,000 total casualties, 1,700 Marines in those casualty figures. So pretty horrific casualties, but of course the Japanese were eroded much worse. As I mentioned, the Devil Dogs go on to New Britain as their next campaign. Not until December 1943, the Devil Dogs come into play because they'd been in the vanguard at Guadalcanal. They're now in reserve for at least for the landings on New Britain. There are some amazing actions fought by K Company that I don't have time to talk about, but if you are good enough to buy and read the book, have a look at Waltz Ridge, because I think it's one of the sort of, unrecognized heroic episodes in the Second World War. But moving on from New Britain, the next campaign is the one where Eugene Sledge, Henry's father, comes into play, and that, of course, is Peleliu. So let's have a little look at Peleliu. That's Guadalcanal, Marines crossing the river, and that's them leaving. There's New Britain. New Britain, interestingly enough, just before I leave it and go on to Peleliu, 370 miles across. So this is a sizable terrain. And actually, you can see some of the track of K Company and the 1st Marine Division fighting on that enormous island. But Peleliu was a totally different kettle of fish. As Rich says, 5 square miles. It's minuscule. It was defended by 11,000 Japanese, strongly dug into the center of the island. Again, there's some fascinating story about the changing tactics that they were using, but I'm just going to follow the Devil Dogs experience for this story, and I'm just going to tell you a couple of the moments that will give you a sense of what they went through. So this is Eugene Sledge's first campaign. Very early on in the campaign, one of the guys attached to K Company, he's not actually a Marine in K Company, cracks up, loses his sort of sensibilities and starts screaming. Now, they try and calm him down. First of all, they try and soothe him. Then they administer some morphine to try and sedate him. That doesn't work. Then they try and knock him out by punching him, and that doesn't work either. So eventually, they hit him with a shovel so hard, it kills him. And this is Eugene's response to that. He wrote of the agony and distress etched on the strong faces of the men who had done what any of us would do in those circumstances. So what are the other stories? Well, wary of the Japanese unwillingness to be taken prisoner, a lot of guys were killed trying to take Japanese prisoner. They basically didn't take many of them prisoner. They went further than that, some of them. They were very keen on taking gold teeth out of the mouths of corpses. There's a situation where even Henry's dad considers it. He manages to pull back from doing that. But even grimmer moments when another Marine shows Eugene the desiccated hand that he's hacked off a corpse and dried in the sun. He's quite proud of this, and he's going to take it back to the United States. So what is Eugene's response to all of this, and how does he make sense of it? He writes, "The war had gotten to my friend. He had lost briefly, I hoped, all his sensitivity. He was a 20th century savage now, mild-mannered though he was. I shuddered to think that I might do the same thing if the war went on and on. And yet, at other times, the Marines could have, of course, show great sensitivity. There's a section in the book where one is literally cradling the head of his dying comrade. And there's also another lovely quote by Eugene Sledge. He makes a bracelet of shells, which he'd found on the beach at Peleliu for his mum, and he sends it home with a letter. And he writes, "I hope, because these dainty little shells come from such a dreadful place, that you won't fail to see their beauty and know that they show you were in my mind constantly." So that's the Marines going in. It was an opposed landing. Oh, it's interesting, isn't it? Iwo Jima, of course, is well known as horrific fighting on the beaches. Peleliu was pretty bad too. You had a double whammy on Peleliu. They fought on the beaches, and they also were firmly ensconced inland. And this is the result of K companies fighting on Peleliu. These are the survivors. They started out 235 strong, and they end up with just 85. And here are some of the key characters. This is Jim McHenry, I mentioned at the beginning. That's R.V. Bergen, another sort of the key players in the story. And thirdly, that's Eugene Sledge in this picture of 85. And so to the final campaign on Okinawa. Again, I don't have time to talk about the detail. It was a meat grinder of a battle that spanned 82 days. The casualties for everyone concerned were horrific. 50,000 casualties for the American Marines and soldiers fighting on that island. The Japanese defenders, 100 to 110,000 strong, were killed almost to a man, as they were on Peleliu. Even worse than that were the number of civilians who died on that island, which made it such a warning for the fight that was going to come if the Japanese home islands had been invaded. 125, or up to 125,000 civilians were killed on Okinawa, and these were deaths, of course, that Eugene Sledge and many others had to witness. And the final picture, this is the mortar section in June. So these are the survivors. Now, there's an interesting statistic which Eugene Sledge has got in his book. There were, I think, let me just get the numbers right, there were 65 veterans, Peleliu veterans, who also fought on Okinawa, including Eugene Sledge. By the end of the Okinawan campaign, there were just 26 still standing, and these are some of them. Eugene is in the center, kneeling down with the helmet on and the pipe in his mouth. And I hope Henry will say a word or two about this picture, because it's really quite remarkable. So just to sum up, K Company fighting through the Pacific, 90 members of the company were killed, hundreds suffered wounds, and arguably just as affecting with the psychological trauma that many of them had to deal with in the years to come, as we are, I think, are going to hear from Henry. So the question is, was it all worth it, which they're bound to ask themselves. And I think Eugene Sledge gives a wonderfully pithy answer to this. There is no such thing as the glory of war, he writes. There is only the horror of war to the men who fight. Unfortunately, until heaven prevails, somebody has got to be ready to defend our country, or we'll lose it. It is a sentiment I think you'll all agree that people in Ukraine today feel just as strongly about. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Rich, and thank you, Saul, for inviting me to be a part of this experience. It's been an honor for my family and me to be here with all of you. As I have become more active in the World War II community, people often say to me that my father's book, With the Old Breed, has been an inspiration to them in so many ways. To dive deeper into World War II history in some cases, and in other cases to even serve their country. Many have said to me that With the Old Breed has helped them understand that war is not just a game of airplanes, tanks, and artillery, but a visceral human experience, and it takes a toll on the people who live through it. But what does that book mean to me as the son of Eugene Sledge? It is literally part of my DNA. It is part of who I am. I grew up watching that book being written and seeing it come to life. Some of my earliest childhood memories are of seeing my father sitting up late at night by the fireplace, writing on a yellow legal pad. I would come through the room clutching my blanket, and I would ask, "What are you doing, Dad?" He would answer, "Nothing, just working on something, get back to bed." He was a little nicer than that, but my father had no desire to be a writer. All he really wanted to be was a scientist. He was also, in my opinion, an all-American dad. He began writing his book as a cathartic process. As the number of those yellow legal pads filled with his penciled handwriting grew into a stack, my mother agreed to begin typing it. There was a little room off the kitchen in our house where I grew up. My mother called it the butler's pantry. I don't know why, because we didn't have a butler. They put a small desk in there with a typewriter, and she began typing what he was writing. He would write by night, and she would type by day, stacking the pages on the corner of that desk. As she read and typed what he was writing, she saw the power and the humanity in the story he was telling. She suggested to him to try to get it published. I still remember my father saying, direct quote, "Who in the hell would want to read it? This is for you and the boys." The stack of typed pages on the corner of that little desk grew rapidly, and my brother and I would frequently stop and read them as we passed through the room. The lexicon of my father's war experience became a part of my own growing up experience. Names like snafu, hillbilly, ack-ack, stumpy. Places like Bloody Nose Ridge, Half Moon Hill. Alphanumeric terms like K35 and Orange Beach 2. These things were commonplace to me. By the late 1970s, that stack of pages had turned into a massive manuscript. My mother eventually prevailed and inspired him to try to get this thing into print. They began reaching out to publishers. I well remember one fine afternoon walking to the mailbox with my father. Inside was a huge manila envelope. It was a copy of the manuscript being sent back from a publisher. As we walked back down to the house, I recall him saying, "Well, I know what this is," as he started reading the letter that was enclosed with it. I asked him, "What does it say, Dad?" He said, "It's somebody sending the manuscript back to me. They're not interested in it." He was very philosophical. It was the second publisher that they had sent it to. Another fine, sunny afternoon, a few months after that, I had just gotten home from school. I was 15 or so. My parents announced to me that they had just heard from the third publisher. My mother said, "Dad's book is going to be published." That was around 1980. In a letter to two fellow K Company men, Stumpy Stanley and Bill Layden, sometime in 1981, right before With the Old Breed was to be published, my father told them how the book was finally done and he was ready to lay down his pen and put all those horrible things out of his mind and move on with his life. He'd had enough of war. When the book actually came out that year, it wasn't long before he started hearing from readers, letters and phone calls. The irony quickly became obvious. He couldn't just put all those horrible things out of his mind and move on with his life. He had to deal with the consequences of his success. Sledgehammer was a non-egocentric individual. His deeper purpose of writing With the Old Breed was not to aggrandize himself, it was to fulfill a mission. He felt driven to tell the story of what he and his fellow devil dogs in K35 endured and the price they paid. A very meaningful quote from the book, I think, encapsulates so much. Quote, "Something in me died at Peleliu. Perhaps it was the childish innocence that accepted as faith the claim that man is basically good. Possibly I lost faith that politicians in high places who do not have to endure war's savagery will ever stop blundering and sending others to endure it." End quote. Growing up as Sledgehammer's son, I saw glimpses of the cost of that savagery. One night in 1971, when I was about 6, we were watching the movie Patton, starring George C. Scott. My father hated war movies and wanted nothing to do with them. Somehow, we talked him into it. I'm actually going to blame that on my older brother because I was only 6 and he was 12, so. During the battle scene where they were in North Africa, it was a relentless cacophony of shell explosions. He became emotional during that scene and went into the kitchen and began pounding the refrigerator. My mother got him to sit down. He was crying. We found out later that when they were under heavy shell fire at Peleliu and Okinawa, they would pound the ground in front of their foxholes in desperation and frustration. I just thought it was because he hated George C. Scott. But hitting the refrigerator that night in 1971 was his Pavlovian response to what he saw and heard on the television set. Now, after relating that story, I want to quickly assure you that Sledgehammer was a master of his emotions. He had a great capacity to compartmentalize what he thought and what he did. He was not a tortured or maladjusted individual. He had a boisterous sense of humor and a zest for life. He was a typical example of an ordinary young man in 1941 who wanted nothing more than to live his life and fulfill his dreams. He went willingly into the abyss of war and had to find his way out. Through the years, I've heard people refer to him almost analytically, dispassionately, such as Sledge wrote this, or Sledge said that, or Sledgehammer, he was the guy in the Pacific. All of this shows how his legacy has grown and endured, and I welcome that as a passionate student of World War II history. But there is a part of me that also thinks Sledgehammer is the guy who taught me to ride a bike in the front yard when I was 5. The same guy who taught me to shoot a .45 automatic pistol out in the woods on a cold winter day when I was 16. The same pistol he carried through Okinawa. It was one of my prized possessions. How do I, as his son, serve his legacy? My love of World War II history, especially his story, is coded into me. It is part of who I am. My father encouraged me to read from an early age, and I spent many hours on the floor in his study looking through the life pictorial history of World War II or some other similar book while he was at his desk working on his own book. We had many conversations in that room about his war experience. Even then, I was impressed by his ability to recall even the most minute details. In 1999, I got the chance to go to Peleliu. I was talking to my girlfriend at the time, now my wife of 22 years, and I was telling her how worried I was about the expense of the trip. She said, "You have to go to Peleliu. It's part of who you are." And she really did say that. She's sitting right there. You can ask her if you don't believe it. I stood on Orange Beach 2, where K-35 landed in 1944. I went to the airfield and walked the area where they went across on D+1 amid a nightmare of snapping bullets and screeching shells. It was plenty hot that day for me, but not nearly as hot as it was for Sledgehammer and his buddies when they went across. I loved the way he told me the story of the airfield attack. He said when they got across to the other side and flopped down to catch their breath, their ears were ringing from the deafening explosions. And one of his buddies, a Cape Gloucester veteran who'd already seen plenty, looked over at him and said, "That was rough duty, Sledgehammer. I'd hate like hell to have to do that every day." All I could hear in that humid, still air in 1999 was the haunting whistle of the bush warblers out in the jungle. And it was a haunting, mournful sound. Through the years, I've seen the influence of With the Old Breed and China Marine, his second book. I've seen the interest people seem to have in Sledgehammer, both as a Marine and as a person. I want to add context and perspective to that with my insight on him, my memories of him that no one else has. The long-term legacy of what he accomplished with his writing was to show the emotional cost to a human being of the savagery of warfare. In so doing, he created an unintended legacy. The book itself and the place it is carved out as, in the words of John Keegan, an arresting document of wartime literature. I'd like to close with a few words on how he saw himself. These lines are from a letter I came across in the archives at Auburn University. It was to Lieutenant Colonel Robert Smith, USMC retired, who edited With the Old Breed. This letter is from 1982, shortly after the book's release, and it's typical Sledgehammer, straightforward, honest, and self-deprecating. Dear Bob, I'm delighted you were pleased with the way Presidio Press designed With the Old Breed. I too think they did a fine job. You certainly caught every detail of the photo on the back, even to the jungle rot on my hand and lower arm. Everyone thinks that photo is very appropriate. However, you can understand why I prefer not to even look at it. Even the faintest recollection of how I felt at the time it was taken is a sensation I prefer to avoid forever. As for my feelings about the book, well, my primary sensation is one of intense relief over its completion and of fulfilling a commitment I made long ago to tell our story like it was on Peleliu and Okinawa. I never thought over those years it would ever get into print one day. Almost every day for the last 2 weeks, I've received a letter or a phone call from some Marine or Navy man, most of whom I never knew or heard of. Most of them say that they realize it must have been a gut-wrenching ordeal to put such an account on paper, far different from sitting around batting the breeze over a beer and telling sea stories. And they're grateful I did it. They actually thank me. With no exaggeration, it is an eerie sensation. I feel as though I've unleashed a genie. I think you know me well enough, Bob, to know that it's not false pride when I say to you, I honestly don't know what is so impressive about With the Old Breed. All I did was keep my eyes open and notice details during the war so I could tell it like it was to my descendants. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Wow. You know, Jeremy, you want to conduct your usual maneuvers?
Thank you, panelists, for a wonderful discussion. We're going to open Q&A, guys. If you want to just raise your hands, and either I or Andrew will come around to you. Panelists, your first question will be to your right towards the back with Andrew.
I've read the book 3 times, and each time felt really good about what I was learning that wasn't in any history book anywhere. But the question I'd like you to maybe elaborate on was, every time they finished a battle, the 1st Marine Division was no longer operational. They'd have such massive casualties. And that was after Guadalcanal. And then they rebuilt it. And they had to go somewhere for R&R to absorb the replacements and train them up. And the same thing then happened every other time they did this. Would you please elaborate, if you can for me, that wonderful resort that they sent them to for the R&R? I would really appreciate that, and I think the audience would too.
Are you asking me or Saul?
Let's all lead it off, and then you can add personal.
Well, you must be talking about Pavuvu. And so to set that in the context, they come out of New Britain, initially land at Cape Gloucester, and then end up halfway along the island, as I think I showed in the map. And they're brought out in early May 1944, and they hope they're going back to Australia, where a lot of them have girlfriends, having been there after Guadalcanal, where they're being built up to land in New Britain in the first place. But they don't go there. Some are even thinking they might go all the way back to the United States. Well, they're definitely not going there. But they are going to Pavuvu, which was an island that had only recently been captured from the Japanese, and it had no infrastructure. Whose idea it was to send them there, we don't know for sure. I mean, we think it's part of the staff of the Marine Corps that was in overall charge of the 1st Marine Division at that time. And we're also pretty sure that the only view they had of the island was from the air. No one had actually looked at it on the ground. When K Company got there, they found the remnants of a coconut plantation, rotting coconuts all over the ground, land crabs as big as plates, and that was it. Now, they do go back after Peleliu to Pavuvu, by which time it's a totally different kettle of fish. The Seabees have been there, and they've turned it into something half reasonable. There's a lovely moment when Eugene Sledge is talking about coming off Peleliu, and he lands on the beach there, and obviously they're all completely disorientated about what they've just been through. And they see these young women who are handing out glasses of orange juice. I mean, it's like they can't believe what they're seeing. But I can assure you, those young women were not there in May 1940, well, May towards the end of June, early June, sorry, 1944, when they first get there. It was a horrific place, and no place, frankly, to properly recover from what they've been through on New Britain. The issue for the US military at that time was the tempo of operations. They are now increasing. They're going to need the 1st Marine Division for Peleliu, and that takes place in September. So there really isn't time to send them anywhere else. They've got to be in the location. They could have, in theory, sent them to Guadalcanal, which at that point was in better nick than Pavuvu, but they choose not to. But the most significant thing of Pavuvu, in my mind, and certainly in the book, is this is where Eugene Sledge joins K Company. And it's quite interesting. I don't know if Henry wants to elaborate on this, but Eugene did not want to join K Company. He didn't want to join the 3/5th Marines. He wanted to join his buddy in the 1st Marines. Is that correct?
Right. His good friend Sid Phillips was an H-21, H Company, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines. And he hoped that he would be put into the 1st Marines, but it actually... He actually said, I can't remember if he said this with the Old Breed, or I may have come across it in his unpublished writing, which I'm researching, but when he was selected to be 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, he knew the storied history of the 5th Marines, going back to Belleau Wood, knew that they had a very proud history, not that any Marine regiment didn't, but he was especially proud to be in the 5th Marines and 1st Marine Division. So he... and again, I can't remember if this was in the unpublished writing or if he said it with the Old Breed. He felt that he had hit the lottery and won, and that was probably the only time in the Pacific War he felt like he won the lottery. But his first impression of Pavuvu was coming across on the President Polk and landing at the Steel Pier in McKitty Bay, I believe it was, and seeing some guys down at the pier as they're shouldering all their gear and coming down the gangplank. And he's literally getting into the theater of war that he had tried to get into when he enlisted in the Marines. And he sees these guys, and they're suntanned, and they all looked really underweight. But they were friendly to them. And they were just smoking cigarettes and relaxing. And his impression of them was these guys just had an air of confidence about them that I couldn't imagine until later.
Let me just insert, I had the great privilege of getting to know Bill Layden and also Sid Phillips. Had significant contact with both, particularly Sid and his sister Catherine, who were featured in Ken Burns' The War. And Sid was not only a wonderful guy, a doctor. You'll notice that both Eugene and Sid go on to be very high-level professionals, a doctor and a professor of biology post-war. And Sid, when I went to visit him at his home, he took me upstairs, and after Eugene had died and the house had been sold, he had sitting in a bedroom upstairs in Sid's home, Eugene Sledge's boyhood bed. He also had a great collection of artifacts the two of them as young kids had collected around Mobile. Sid was a real inspiration, and when we were doing the Road to Tokyo exhibit, I had so hoped that Sid was going to make it to the opening in December 2015, but it became clear in the spring that that was not to be. So after we did one of our final reviews of the content of the entire Road to Tokyo exhibit, I gathered all that together in the videos, and I drove over to Mobile and showed that to Sid. So he got to see what was going to be, even though he was not going to be there. And if you go to the Guadalcanal exhibit, you'll hear, the very first voice you hear is Sid Phillips. I had my oar in the water on that, and it's no accident that Sid Phillips is the first voice you hear at the Guadalcanal exhibit.
Sid he was never Dr. Phillips. Sid was Uncle Sid to me growing up. That's the only thing I ever called him.
We're going to go to your right, all the way towards the back, gentlemen. This is to Henry. I enjoyed and was greatly in awe of the books. I read the one on China Marine, and one of the more compelling stories was your father's talking about the people he met and became friends with, including Chinese families and a priest. In the book, he indicates he never knew what became of those families he became friends with due to the Civil War in China. I was wondering if you ever learned what happened to those people he wrote so affectionately about.
I do not, sadly. I can't give you any more information on that. I know, looking through my father's papers in the archives at Auburn University, I've seen some letters, but nothing post-dated from the war out, far enough out, that would give me any indication of what happened to them. But that was cherished time for him in China.
Next question is going to be to your left in the front, please.
My question's for Saul and also for Rich. In Eric Bergerud's book, Touch with Fire, he talks about the Gurkha Patrol. And his argument is contrast to John Dower, who calls the war in the Pacific this racist war. Bergerud says the key event is the Gurkha Patrol. He says before that, it's not, that particular event changes the whole nature of the Pacific War towards the brutality that it ends up with. From your observations, is that true? Did it have that kind of effect on especially on the American side?
I think the first thing you could say is it definitely had that effect on everyone in 1st Marine Division. But you've already had the death march at Bataan at this point. That I think the Americans generally are under no illusion at this sort of, the obdurate and pretty ruthless opponent they're up against. Having said that, to actually experience it on the ground and to see it, and what's interesting about the K Company veterans writing about finding the Gurkha Patrol is the news of what they'd seen spread right through the division. And as you can see from the quote I gave, there are other quotes from other members of K Company who basically say from that point onwards, it was all bets off in terms of how we were going to behave towards them. So it was psychologically, it was a real swing moment. But remember, it's right at the beginning of their very first campaign, so it doesn't take them long to realize, which of course the British had already had a pretty good experience, the British and Commonwealth troops fighting the Japanese earlier in Malaya, the consequences of getting yourself into the hands of the Japanese. I mean, they did take prisoners, of course, in Malaya, but in these island battles, very few prisoners were taken by either side, and it's one of the tragedies, really, of the campaign.
This gets to a really profound issue with respect to the whole Asia-Pacific War. And John Dower's book, War Without Mercy, particularly stressed the racial angle to this. In terms of what happened in 1942, you have to remember that up to the moment the Marines landed on Guadalcanal, there was no American who had witnessed testimony of what it was like to fight the Japanese on the ground. Everyone who had in the Philippines was either dead or a prisoner. So this was a de novo encounter with the Japanese Armed Forces by the 1st Marine Division. And there were really 2 events that happened very closely together. The first was this patrol. The message from this patrol was the Japanese were not taking prisoners. Then shortly after that, you had the Battle of the Tenaru. And in the aftermath of that, where this Japanese reinforced battalion's mini regiment is virtually wiped out along the Tenaru River. In the immediate aftermath, the Marines and corpsmen are sweeping over this god-awful slaughter in front of them. And instead of being able to find surviving Japanese and provide treatment for them and take them prisoner, instead they encounter repeated episodes where the Japanese, who were still conscious and still able to do so, attempt to take a last Marine or a corpsman with them. They use grenades. They almost killed the operations officer of the 1st Marine Division, who is looking down when a Japanese soldier discharges a pistol in his face. And basically, in my view, this is what happened. You had in these 2 episodes 2 messages. The Japanese are not taking prisoners. The Japanese will not surrender. And oh, by the way, if you think you're going to take a Japanese prisoner, you are basically gambling your life and the life of your buddies that your judgment about what this guy's intentions are correct. The next thing that happens, like Saul said, is this is Gerhard Weinberg, our great colleague. He talks about the word, which is basically not necessarily what's written down, but the way stories are told within units and the way stories are disseminated, whatever. The story of what had happened to the 1st Marine Division at that patrol and the Tenero spread like wildfire to the American Armed Forces, that if you're fighting the Japanese on the ground, or at sea for that matter, there were episodes like that, this is the terms on which the Japanese are fighting. And for most Americans, the judgment was not simply that the Japanese were of a different race. They were like aliens from another planetary system. Nobody fought this way. The Japanese armed forces are the only armed forces in modern time that literally, repeatedly fought to the last man or virtual last man. Nobody else fought under those terms. Christopher Bailey and Jim Harper, in their book about forgotten armies and forgotten wars or whatever here, they expanded their discussion of this into, well, if you look at it, certainly racism was present, but you'll notice that, oh, by the way, in Burma, where the Japanese are fighting primarily troops from India, the British Indian Army, and they're also, in the last campaigns, they're fighting Africans from East and West Africa. And as Bailey and Harper write, the terms on which the Indians and the blacks from Africa were fighting the Japanese were the same as what the Americans were in the Pacific. There's a poem by one of the Indian soldiers, an officer, about one of the big battles, Kohima, we mentioned this morning or whatever. And in that poem, he has this line, "No prisoners we took, no mercy we gave. The crimes against our comrades we never forgave." And that was basically everybody who fought the Japanese, and this extends to the Chinese also, basically had the same attitude about this. There was race certainly present, but by God, it was the terms on which the Japanese were fighting that drove everybody to this savagery. And the final point I would make is, if the whole thing was based on white-hot racism to the end, when we got into Japan, why weren't we slaughtering every Japanese male and raping every Japanese woman? It's like you threw a switch. The Japanese were no longer doing what had driven us to such incredible savagery in the Pacific. They now were defeated foe.
Next question is going to be in the front to your left, please.
I'll direct this to Henry. I had an uncle, my mother's brother, who was in a heavy artillery outfit in France. And years later, myself as an adult, I heard something out of him that you mentioned that really rang a bell for me, and that is he had an incredible recollection of the war in minute detail and vast amounts of material. But he said something else that I'll tell you, and I'd like to hear your father's reaction. Again, later in life, I asked him how he felt the war affected him. And he said it was really kind of simple. I came home so happy to be alive. Nothing really bothered me of any significance. What was your father's position along those lines?
Oh, to a large degree, exactly what you said. I know that he spoke that my grandfather, who had treated shell shock victims, as they were called, from World War I, was a tremendous help to him. My father told me he did a lot of just sitting around staring at the wall when he first got home. And I will say that the scene in the Pacific in Part 10 where he's sitting under the tree drinking iced tea and my grandmother comes out there and, "Eugene, what are you doing? What's to become of you?" And my grandfather came out there and said, "Leave him alone, Mary Frank. You have no idea what that boy's been through." My father told me that story himself before HBO ever heard it. When my brother or I or anybody would complain about things, my father would say, "Hell, I'm just glad I got dry socks." If I complained about what my mother prepared for dinner, you know, he would just look at me and say, "You don't know what a bad day is." and he was a little nicer than that, but I mean, trust me, as his youngest son, I pushed him to his limits, probably worse than the Japanese ever did, but it informed his thinking for the rest of his life. He appreciated so many things.
Next, we're going to go to your right, all the way in the back, please.
As far as I know, I'm the senior Marine president, so I feel a compulsion to say something about Guadalcanal, which, in fact, I've written about in 3 different books. One thing I'd caution the audience is that you see war at different levels, and it's not that the authenticity of Eugene Sledge's experience and those of his comrades should be questioned. It's just simply that one has to deal with various levels of responsibility, and the action occurs at different levels. I happen to be the biographer of Gerald C. Thomas, who was the operations officer for the 1st Marine Division and then as chief of staff on Guadalcanal, and I certainly got inside the Thomas family, and I had a working relationship with Merrill Twining, also a Marine general, who became Thomas's successor as the division G3. They thought the Getchy Patrol was about as big a screw-up as you could imagine. General Vandegrift, frankly, did not have as good a grasp on the situation as his staff thought he should, and the only person that could convince him to do anything differently was Merritt Edson, who was the head of the Raider Battalion and then commander of the 5th Marines. If it hadn't been for Edson, the 1st Division would have been in serious trouble on a number of occasions. When the Getchy Patrol went out and did not come back, the division lost practically all of its expertise in the Japanese language and order of battle of the Japanese army. It was replaced by a businessman who spoke Japanese named Moran, who was a reserve lieutenant colonel, and Martin Clemens, who was a coast watcher. In fact, I helped Mr. Clemens do his autobiography, published by the Naval Institute Press. And what one sees, frankly, is a Marine division that was almost clueless as to how to fight anybody at that particular point of the war. I ran across a situation where Clifton Cates, commander of the 1st Regiment, and Jerry Thomas were sitting together under a Japanese bombardment saying, well, I guess we're going to have to learn the sound of different guns. These don't sound like the Germans. Both of them were veterans of World War I. And you often overlook the fact that at the field grade and company commander level, the 1st Division was blessed with a large number of World War I veterans who certainly knew a great deal more about war than it sometimes appears. It was unfortunate that Vandegrift was not one of those people, and his staff and senior officers spent a great deal of time trying to work around him and to make sure that, in fact, things that he was intended to do or wanted to do did not happen. The real challenge was to make sure the division was still there when we got reinforcements and aviation came in. Cactus Air Force was created, and the operation went as they hoped it would. It doesn't take anything away from the experiences of the junior troops. It's just sometimes one has to also elevate to another level of analysis and appreciation. I guess one of the worst things somebody ever said to me one time was, "You write like a goddamn colonel." Well, I was. Still am.
We're going to go to your left with Connie.
Thank you. Thank you. I read The Old Breed, and it stunned me. As the landings on Okinawa initially were unopposed by the Japanese strategy. When the casualties got to be so great, going for the southern part of Okinawa, was there any thought of just sealing that off and moving all American forces to the north, which apparently it was taken quite readily, and they could have just moved the operation north out of the range of the Japanese in the south, just seal them off? Or is that just, once the operation began, they couldn't change tactics?
I'd be interested to hear Richard's feeling about this. I didn't see any indication that they were seriously considering that in the discussion that was going on at Army level and Corps level. It seemed to have a kind of life of itself. One thing you could say that was never tried and probably should have been is a landing below the main Japanese defensive system, which, as Rich showed in the initial slide, was in the southern third of the island, but there was space below that for them to land. Now, this was suggested by a number of key people, key subordinates of the Army commander, but it was turned down each time. That's Buckner, of course. And he used, the argument that there would be a danger they'd be trapped on the beaches, but they had some pretty good capability. The 77th Army Division had amphibious capability, and it was recommended by Bruce, the divisional commander, that they do that. And given that the consequences of battering their heads against effectively a brick wall in the center of the island were so costly, it strikes me that that was something that probably should have been tried. And the last point I'll make about that is that the Japanese themselves, and we know this from Yahara was the operations officer and left behind an amazing testimony, very unusual for a senior Japanese commander to survive a battle of this type, but he was dispatched back to Japan to give the bad news effectively, and he wrote an incredibly revealing account of the battle in which he insists that it was their big fear that an amphibious landing would take place and that they'd actually held up troops to guard the southern beaches for a certain point until casualties were so serious in the center of the island that they had to move them forward. And that was the point, and I think Rich has made this point himself when we discussed it, that was the point at which they probably should have given the second landing a go. But to answer your question, I haven't seen any indication that they were seriously considering shutting off one part of the island. Last thing I'll say on that, really last thing, is that's pretty much what they did in New Britain. So it's not a totally mad idea, but New Britain was a huge island. And one of the capabilities the Japanese had on Okinawa was a lot of artillery, and they could still have done a fair amount of damage with it. So I think they felt they needed to go on and take the whole island.
Yeah, I essentially agree with virtually all of that. I think the other thing you have to understand when we talk about these levels of war, you've got to understand that at this point in early 1945, you're looking at the total order of battle of Marine and Army divisions in the Pacific. You're planning the next step after Okinawa is going to be the invasion of Japan, and that's going to be in 2 phases. And all those divisions that are then in the Pacific are going to be needed, and they're earmarked for those operations. So in other words, there's no spare divisions to leave behind to hold this cordon to seal off the Japanese on Okinawa. And I can't point to you to specific evidence that I've ever seen that this was sort of a conscious thing by Buckner. But I think Buckner clearly understood that part of his mission was to clean the entire island, finish the campaign with those divisions so those divisions were available for future operations. And I think that probably played a part. And I think the point, Saul and I had talked about this, Buckner actually, there were 2 major points where Buckner was urged to conduct a landing to the south. With the first one, I think Buckner had some reasonable arguments, especially the fact the Japanese, as Saul said and Yohara said, the Japanese had kept units in reserve exactly for that possibility. When those units were committed to the front line, that was the moment when I revisited the issue of landing to the south should have been seriously considered. Besides crushing the 32nd Army, the other thing about had that landing taken place that probably would have been very important was for the Okinawans, because the stupendous number of Okinawan civilian deaths on Okinawa occurred in that compressed area down there in the south of the island. where the Okinawans, I believe, say that there are like 150,000 dead Okinawans as a result of that campaign. They have a memorial that itemizes all of that. But that's essentially how I would sum it up.
Next question is in the center aisle towards the back, please, with Connie.
Dr. Frank, thank you for expertly articulating the savagery of the Japanese warrior. Mr. Sledge, in the museum where I volunteer, every day I listen to your father. We have a video. I don't know of another person who expertly describes the inhumanity of war. And finally, Dr. David, would you kindly speak about the climate in which the Marines were fighting and the diseases and the bugs and crabs? It's pretty significant.
And rain and mud.
Yeah, actually, I'll go to New Britain. I mentioned a little bit of that when I was talking about Guadalcanal, but New Britain actually was worse, if anything. They were describing, the guys in Company K, 200 feet high trees. This is jungle. As soon as they landed, the jungle came pretty much up to the shore. I also mentioned that Company K arrived a few days after the main body of the 1st Marine Division, but it was immediately pitched into an unbelievably brutal campaign. So you've got the wet weather, almost constant rain, and churning up the mud. So they're moving through a jungle where they can't see anything ahead of them, and the jungle is being completely it's a quagmire. So the chances of bringing up supporting heavy weapons, artillery, of course, was vanishingly small. There's one, just to move on from that, I mentioned Waltz Ridge, this extraordinary battle. What's significant about that battle is that despite all the difficulties, despite the fact that even in a very short time, the ability of Company K to fight a battle of this type was already eroded. This is just 10 days into the campaign. And despite all of that, Walt, who was the battalion commander, who had, I think, been 2IC, second in command, XO of the regiment, but then had to come in because the battalion commander was wounded. Walt personally organizes the dragging of a field piece, probably 37 millimeter field piece, up this slope to the just below the ridge line, which is where Company K had got, so that they could hold on to that position during the night. And it's the Japanese attempt to take that gun effectively and sweep Company K off the top of the hill, which is what makes it such an epic encounter. And Walt is rewarded with a Navy Cross, but in my view, he deserved a Congressional Medal of Honor for what he did that day. I mean, he led by example in a way that the only thing I can think of that compares to it in the British Army is H. Jones in winning a Victoria Cross in the Falkland Islands, for which he was heavily criticized and has been ever since. But if you speak to the men of Two Para who fought with him that day, they have no criticism of him. And of course, the men of Company K, Two Para, and the men of Company K were unbelievably grateful at Walt's leadership. And the other person who did fantastically in that battle, of course, is Haldane, who I didn't have time to talk about, but just read Eugene Sledge's account of, well, I won't give the game away if you don't know what happens to Haldane and you haven't seen the Pacific, but he is an example of the right type of officer, an officer who has firmness in his leadership, but also has sensitivity to his men and always never expects them to do anything he won't do. And he is awarded the Silver Star. And again, that was probably a grade or two too low for what he deserved for that battle.
Cape Gloucester, I want to talk about a little bit because it reinforces one of the earlier points I made. The Japanese put up a ferocious resistance in the area that the Marines initially land in under these, the rain is continuous. The Pacific series captures that very well, just utter misery. And the Japanese are decimated, starving. They sustain their resistance long past their logistical sell-by date. And finally, they began to retreat along that incredibly long New Britain up to their main base up at Rabaul. And what happens during that retreat is, at least as far as I understand, is one of the rare moments in the whole Pacific War where a Japanese unit loses cohesion so badly that they began to abandon people, leaving them behind. They were too sick, too exhausted to carry on. Now, the 1st Marine Division has a very well-earned reputation for being really tough. And as they pursue the Japanese and they begin to encounter all these individuals who've been left behind, after a very short time, they realize these people are so debilitated, they are not a threat like regular. And the 1st Marine Division takes an incredible number of prisoners of war during that pursuit phase when they're encountering Japanese soldiers who they understand do not present the normal threat that you don't know what you're really getting when you think you're looking at a surrender. They take almost 10% of the total Japanese garrison a prisoner of war on New Britain. The usual figure is no more than 3% or something like that. But once again, this gets back to racism was certainly present, but the terms on which the Japanese insisted that the war be fought, that was the single thing that drove everybody who fought them nuts.
I think we have time for one last question. We're going to go to your right, towards the middle.
There you go. Work for your dad. This question is for Mr. Sledge. I think it's fair to say your dad was a pretty serious guy. So I just want to know, how did he deal with lackadaisical college students?
Well, I could answer the question on how he dealt with a lackadaisical high school student, but he did not deal with it very well. He was a pretty outspoken guy. He would haul them in and tell them what they needed to do. And I don't think he could teach in this day and age. I don't think he would last very long. But he didn't have a lot of tolerance for just not doing your damn job, if I can just say it like that. I mean, oops. That's the best way to say it.
Let me add that we had an earlier session in one of the museum programs. Some people who had been students of Eugene Sledge at Montevideo College over here were talking. And one of the point they made was he was a really tough instructor, but they had no idea whatsoever of what his war experience had been until the Old Breed came out. You know, this was just total shock that they had never realized what the background of Eugene Sledge was.
So I know Henry referenced it earlier, but talking about students, talking about legacy, I'd like to ask that Andrea Sledge and Jack Sledge please stand. Jack is the grandson of Eugene Sledge. They've been dear friends of the museum and mine personally for some time, and it's always great to see them. So thank you for sharing Henry and the story with us.
If I could quickly mention, those of you who have heard of Joseph Alexander, the Marine Corps historian, my son is named after him. His full name is Joseph Alexander Sledge.
Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause for Richard Frank, Saul David, and Henry Sledge.